Greetings, fellow VR kittens, back again for another episode of XR Muse. This week, we've got a pretty interesting litter box full of news to paw through. John Carmack's been stirring the catnip with some spicy takes as always. Meta's got everyone wondering what they're really focusing on these days. And Samsung is pouncing into the XR arena. Should be a fun deep dive, so let's jump right in.
Yeah, it really does seem like the XR landscape is constantly shifting. I think Carmack's comments have definitely sparked the most debate online this week. He's arguing that standalone VR, like we see with the Quest, and with Beat Saber as a prime example, has had a much bigger impact on the industry than PC VR and even Half-Life, Alyx, which is interesting.
Yeah, that statement about Beat Saber being more impactful than Half-Life.
Alyx.
Definitely raised some eyebrows, even among us cool cats. I mean, Alyx is practically VR royalty.
Yeah.
But I think Carmack's really focusing on accessibility and reach here, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. He's basically saying that standalone VR, like the Quest, really opened up VR to a much wider audience. It's the same thing that made mobile gaming so successful, right? Affordability and just ease of access. And he thinks that focusing too much on these high-end PC VR experiences is kind of limiting the potential for broader adoption. So it's a bit like comparing a fancy cat tree reserved for just a select few felines versus, a comfy cardboard box that everyone can enjoy.
That's a perfect analogy. And the sales figures really back up Carmack's point, I think. Beat Saber on the Quest has sold over 10 million copies, which is astounding. And that's not even counting all the revenue from all those catchy DLC and music packs. On the other hand, Half-Life, Alyx, even though it's, a critical darling, has only sold an estimated 2 to 4 million copies on Steam. So that's a pretty big difference in reach.
That's a really compelling point. But does that mean Carmack thinks developers should just completely abandon PC VR? And just focus on making, simpler, more accessible games for standalone headsets?
Well, not necessarily. I don't think he's advocating for a complete abandonment of PC VR. But he does think that, those big AAA studios with tons of resources, they should maybe consider treating VR as like a bonus feature instead of pouring all of their effort into these dedicated VR-only titles. So imagine a studio creates this amazing game for traditional flat screens.
Yeah.
And then they offer an optional VR mode for players who have the hardware.
Ooh, that's interesting. Kind of like dangling a feathery toy in front of both the casual kitty and the hardcore gamer. It lets those studios cater to a wider audience while still pushing the boundaries of VR. But Carmack's comments definitely got the claws out in the XR community.
Oh, absolutely. The comment section was just packed with people debating, the cultural impact of Beat Saber versus Half-Life. Alyx. Some people argued that Alyx, even with, its lower sales figures, really pushed the boundaries of VR storytelling and world building, in ways that Beat Saber just couldn't because it's so focused on rhythm and action.
That's a good point. It really does seem like both games have played a huge role in shaping the VR landscape, just in very different ways. It's like comparing a sleek Siamese with a playful Maine Coon. They're both beautiful and fascinating in their own right. But I do find it interesting that Carmack chose to focus mainly on the numbers.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense from a business perspective, right? But like you said, there's more to consider than just sales figures. I think Half-Life, Alyx, has definitely had a huge impact on the industry. It's really inspired developers to strive for greater narrative depth and immersion in their VR experiences.
So almost like Alyx created this whole new standard for VR. A standard that might not have even been possible without those blockbuster sales figures from games like Beat Saber.
Yeah, exactly. It's this complex ecosystem where both accessibility and innovation are so important for the industry to continue growing. But speaking of complex ecosystems, I think we need to shift our focus to Meta and what some are calling the metaverse model. They seem to be putting a lot of stock into Horizon Worlds, and not all VR developers are thrilled about it.
Yeah, this whole situation has a lot of folks hissing and spitting. What exactly are developers most concerned about with this apparent shift in Meta's focus?
One of the biggest concerns I've seen is about discoverability on the Meta Store. You remember App Lab, right? It used to be this separate space where developers could showcase their experimental or early access VR experiences.
Yeah, App Lab.
Yeah.
The perfect playground for indie developers to test their claws. But that's gone now, right?
Yeah, it is. Meta recently merged App Lab into the main store. And while that might sound like a good thing in theory, it's actually created a bit of a cat-astrophe for discoverability.
So instead of having this dedicated space for all that experimental content, it's all just mixed in with the big names and established titles. It sounds like it would be pretty tough for a small indie developer to stand out in that crowd.
Exactly. And to make matters even worse, there's been this huge influx of lower quality games flooding the store. We're talking about those really simple, hastily made experiences, sometimes even blatant clones of popular titles like Gorilla Tag.
Ugh, those copycats are the worst. Always trying to steal the spotlight from the original trailblazers. So how is this impacting the developers who are really putting in the work to craft these high-quality VR experiences?
It's definitely creating a lot of frustration and uncertainty. These developers are really struggling to get their work noticed amidst all that clutter. And the situation's even more concerning for the developers who are making, premium paid VR experiences.
Yeah, it's got to be like trying to sell a gourmet catnip blend
Yeah.
in a market that's overflowing with generic brands. No matter how good your product is, it's going to be tough to compete if you're constantly being overshadowed. So we've got this influx of lower quality games. A lot of them are free to play, or they rely heavily on those in-app purchases. Is that something that Meta is actively encouraging, do you think?
Well, it certainly seems that way. I mean, their response to these concerns has basically been to double down on the whole free-to-play and in-app purchase model, Especially within Horizon Worlds, they're arguing that, these models can coexist with premium paid experiences. But a lot of developers aren't really buying it.
Yeah, I can see why they'd be a little skeptical. I mean, it's like trying to convince a cat to pay for a fancy scratching post when there's a perfectly good cardboard box sitting right next to it.
Exactly. And, if we kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture here, it does seem like Meta might be, shifting their target audience towards a younger demographic, the ones who are more accustomed to those free-to-play games with microtransactions, which makes sense, from a business growth perspective. But it does raise some questions about the long-term health of the VR gaming market. If all those premium experiences end up getting squeezed out.
Yeah, it's that classic dilemma, isn't it? Short-term gains versus, the long-term sustainability of the whole ecosystem. But hey, it's not all doom and gloom, is it? I mean, there are some real success stories out there.
Yeah.
Like Walkabout Mini Golf with its paid DLC model.
Oh, absolutely. Walkabout Mini Golf is a perfect example of a premium VR game that's really found a way to thrive in this, evolving market. It just goes to show that there's still a strong demand for well-made paid VR experiences, especially those with, a really strong multiplayer and social component.
So it sounds like, developers really need to be adaptable and find some creative ways to monetize their work in this ever-changing landscape. But enough about Meta for now. Let's talk about the new cat on the block.
Yeah.
The one who's making all the other felines a little bit nervous, Samsung.
Yeah.
They just pounced into the XR arena with their new Moohan headset.
Yeah.
And it sounds like they're not messing around.
No, they're not. Samsung's entry into the market is a pretty big deal, I think. And they're coming in with a very different approach. This Moohan headset, which they developed in collaboration with Google, it boasts some pretty impressive features, like AI integration and a real focus on connecting seamlessly with Samsung's whole ecosystem of devices.
Seamless connection with their ecosystem, huh? Sounds like they're aiming for something bigger than just a VR gaming device, almost like they're trying to create a central hub for all sorts of digital activities. Entertainment, productivity, communication, maybe even smart home control.
You're right on the money. It's a pretty bold vision, I think. They're really trying to position this Moohan headset as this versatile tool for a wide range of users. Imagine you just slip on your headset, and you can not only explore these amazing virtual worlds, but you can also attend meetings, manage your calendar, control your lights, maybe even order some cat food, all with just a few voice commands.
Wow, that's quite the leap. But what does this mean for the existing players in the XR space then? Like Meta and Apple. Are we going to see like a three-way battle for XR dominance?
Well, it's certainly starting to look that way. I mean, each company brings its own strengths and strategies to the table, right? Meta has this massive content library, and they're clearly focused on gaming. Although, as we discussed, their priorities seem to be shifting a little bit. Apple has that reputation for, sleek design and a seamless user experience. But they've been pretty quiet about their plans so far. And now we have Samsung entering the fray. With this Google-powered AI-infused ecosystem play, it's going to be really interesting to see how it all plays out.
It's like watching a room full of cats suddenly realize that there's a laser pointer dancing on the wall. Everyone's going to be vying for that attention. But, as exciting as all this innovation is, this episode hasn't been all sunshine, and catnip has it. I mean, we've also seen some pretty concerning developments, like those layoffs at several prominent VR companies, including SideQuest and InDreams.
Yeah, unfortunately, those layoffs are a tough reminder that the VR industry, even with all its potential, is still facing some serious challenges. especially when it comes to the economics of it all. Developing for VR is expensive, and the market, while it's growing, it's still nowhere near as big as, traditional gaming. So yeah, some companies are having to make some really difficult decisions just to stay afloat.
It's tough. I guess it's a reminder that the industry is still relatively young and it's still trying to find its footing, like a kitten, trying to navigate a world full of towering furniture and precarious objects. There are bound to be some stumbles along the way.
Exactly. But it also shows the passion and resilience of the people in this industry. I mean, they really believe in the potential of VR, and they're not giving up easily.
I love that. But let's not forget about another issue that's been causing a lot of debate lately. Meta's evolving content moderation policies. They've been getting a lot of heat for some of their recent changes, which some people see as harmful or restrictive. How are these changes impacting the industry as a whole?
Well, it's a complicated issue for sure. I think these changes have raised a lot of concerns among developers about the ethical implications of working with Meta. Some are even questioning whether they can, in good conscience, continue to support a platform that's making decisions they fundamentally disagree with.
Yeah, that's going to be a tough spot for developers to be in. I mean, they
Yeah.
want to reach the widest possible audience, of course, and Meta's platform certainly offers that opportunity. But they also have to weigh that against their own values and principles.
Exactly. It really raises a lot of questions about, the future of content moderation in VR and how developers can navigate these challenges while still staying true to their creative visions and their ethical standards.
Wow, it really does feel like we're at a crossroads here in the XR world. So much innovation and potential, but also, you know, so many uncertainties and challenges. What do you think all of this means for the future of XR?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The XR landscape is always changing. Trying to predict the future is like herding a room full of kittens, chaotic and unpredictable. But I do think one thing is clear. Standalone VR is here to stay. It's really opened up XR to a much wider audience. And that's got to be a good thing, right?
Yeah, definitely. But what about those, those really high quality premium VR experiences, the ones that really push the boundaries of what's possible? Can those still thrive in a market that seems to be, shifting more and more towards those free-to-play games and microtransactions?
That's a really good question. It might all come down to finding the right balance, I think. Developers need to be creative and adaptable. They got to explore new ways to monetize their work without having to compromise on quality or innovation. Things like subscription models, episodic content, partnerships with hardware manufacturers. There are a lot of possibilities out there.
It sounds like we're entering a really exciting, but also kind of uncertain period where developers really need to be nimble and resourceful to succeed.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating to watch. We're seeing these new players like Samsung coming in with fresh ideas. We're seeing those established companies like Meta wrestling with these complex questions
Yeah.
about content moderation and platform responsibility. And we're seeing all these passionate developers pushing the boundaries of creativity and technology, even when they're facing all these, economic headwinds.
That's a wild ride for sure.
Mhm.
Any parting words of wisdom for our listeners before we wrap things up? Any nuggets of wisdom to help them navigate this crazy world of XR?
Well, I'd say stay curious, stay informed, and never be afraid to try new things. The future of XR is being written right now, and we all have a part to play in shaping it. Support the developers who are making the experiences that really resonate with you. Engage in constructive conversations about the challenges and opportunities that we're all facing. And most importantly, never stop exploring. The possibilities are practically endless.
Beautifully said. Well, that's all the catnip we have time for today, fellow VR kittens. We hope you enjoyed this week's deep dive into the latest XR news. Until next time, keep your claws sharp, your whiskers twitching, and your curiosity burning bright.